My name is Bill Clifford. I'm president of the World Affairs Councils of America. Welcome to our 2015 annual national conference, Leading America, Foreign Policy Challenges, and the 2016 election. Thank you very much for coming out tonight. I'm going to be extremely brief and do things in reverse order because our keynote speaker will be boarding a plane at 7:30 tonight for Vienna. 10:30 tonight, but she has to be at the airport and leave here at 7:30. So I hope you've availed yourself of some very nice refreshments at the receptions and that you will hold your hunger for the time being. I also, before introducing Assistant Secretary Richard, would like to reflect briefly in a minute of silence for our veterans, because this is Veterans Day. It's nice of you to be here on this national holiday of great import. Thank you, and to those in the audience who are retired and in uniform and still in service, perhaps, thank you very much. In the interest of brevity, I would like to read a brief poem by Emily Dickinson. These strangers in a foreign world, protection asked of me. Befriend them, lest yourself in heaven be found a refugee. We are delighted tonight to have Ann Richard, Assistant Secretary of State for Population, Refugees, and Migration, be with us to keynote our conference opener. Ann was sworn in April 2012. Prior to this, she was Vice President, of Government Relations and Advocacy for the International Rescue Committee, IRC, an international aid agency that helps refugees, those who have been internally displaced, and victims of conflict. She's had a long career in the State Department. She began her career in government in 1984 as a presidential management intern, which should give some encouragement to the many students here tonight, and I will introduce you all later, and I will thank our generous sponsors later. We're also pleased to have Dina Smeltz from the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, who will be speaking after dinner. But now, in the interest of time and the interest of a timely topic, I welcome Assistant Secretary Ann Richard. Thank you for speaking at World Affairs Councils. Thank you for being here tonight with the World Affairs Councils of America.
I was looking for the step up here, thinking that only Bill Clifford could get up here. He'd have to read my speech for me. This may sound a little familiar to the World Affairs Councils of Louisville, Kentucky, and Seattle, Washington. I just spoke Monday night in Seattle. And I had written this speech originally because I was concerned people were not paying attention to the refugee and migration crisis, and was thinking about this early spring, early summer. And of course now, it's been on the newspaper pages, front pages, and in the headlines every week. And I think that a lot of Americans are concerned. I mean, the world has been riveted by the largest refugee crisis Europe has faced in generations. The tragic stories and images we've seen remind us that these are families just like our own. They have toddlers who wear little shoes. They have been torn out of their normal lives and subjected to horrors because of the accident of where they were born. What I want to do is talk about the bigger picture, why this is happening, and what can be done. Europe's dilemma is one dimension of a global problem that has driven 60 million people from their homes. More people are now forcibly displaced than at any time since World War II. Americans can take heart that we are already a leader in helping refugees and delivering aid around the world. We also lead the world in resettling refugees in this country. Today I want to tell you about refugees, internally displaced persons, and migrants, how they are similar and different, and what more we can do to help them. Let's start by asking why record numbers of people are on the move. In the past 5 years, violence has erupted, smoldered, or flared anew, terrorizing and scattering civilians. In the Middle East, conflict has ravaged Syria, Iraq, Yemen, and Gaza. In Africa, it has shaken the Central African Republic, Libya, Mali, northeastern Nigeria, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, South Sudan, Burundi, and Somalia. In Ukraine, Burma, Pakistan, and Afghanistan, violence and persecution continues to uproot people as well. Today's conflicts are not just numerous. They are often brutal, chronic, and intractable. Long-term, unceasing violence or oppression means that uprooted people aren't able to go home. 45% of refugees today are displaced for 5 years or more. These are not short-term emergencies, and some last much longer than 5 years. A child born in a refugee camp at the start of a crisis will often spend his or her entire childhood away from home. In some situations, and think of the Dadaab camp in Kenya, for example, camp midwives deliver the grandchildren of the original refugees. Refugees, who numbered 19.5 million last year, make up just one segment of the population that's on the move. The legal definition of a refugee is someone who has fled across international borders because they have a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion. But most of the 60 million people displaced globally are not refugees. Approximately 38 million are internally displaced persons, or IDPs, who have not crossed international borders. For instance, when ISIL or Daesh seized roughly a third of Iraq, more than 3 million people fled, not to neighboring countries, but to other parts of Iraq, especially the Kurdish areas in the northeast of the country. Internally displaced persons do not enjoy the same types of protection that refugees do under international treaties and international law. The 1951 Refugee Convention and its 1967 protocol do not apply to them. Their own governments are responsible for protecting them. And sometimes these governments are the problem. Syria is home to about 7 million IDPs, or 1/5 of the world's total. The Assad regime drops barrel bombs on its own people, destroying hospitals and schools and killing rebels and civilians alike. In South Sudan, leaders have put their own feuds ahead of the welfare of their people, repeatedly pushing the country to the brink of famine, ensuring that one of the world's poorest countries remains that way. Despite the recently signed peace agreement, government and opposition forces continue to violate the ceasefire that they agreed to honor. Combatants also thwart efforts to help. The Geneva Conventions state that non-combatants must be treated humanely. International humanitarian law prohibits directing attacks against civilians, including civilian aid workers delivering assistance. But militias and governments alike flout these rules. Despite 2 United Nations Security Council resolutions authorizing the delivery of aid into Syria, humanitarian workers continue to be threatened and killed. In South Sudan, combatants have attacked food convoys, kidnapped and killed aid workers, and fired mortars and rocket-propelled grenades into UN compounds where terrified civilians had sought refuge. So let's review. Refugees are people who leave their own country to save themselves from persecution or war, and internally displaced people, or IDPs, are those who flee the violence but try to survive within the boundaries of their home country. So, who are the migrants? A migrant is anyone on the move from country to country. It can be a hotly recruited tech genius being hired by a company in Silicon Valley, or it can be someone at the bottom of the economic ladder willing to take any job but looking for a steady paycheck and a chance in a different country. Like IDPs and refugees, migrants traveling without documents can be exceptionally vulnerable. Americans have been shocked by images of half-starved people from Bangladesh and Burma abandoned on boats by ruthless smugglers and also shocked by reports of boats sinking and capsizing off of Lampedusa in the Mediterranean, drowning hundreds of migrants at a time. Economic migrants suffer alongside refugees. Both are subject to the same threats. They can be abused and crammed into the same trucks, cages, and leaky rubber boats. In Malaysia and Indonesia, traumatized Bangladeshis told me about being starved and beaten by the crew on ships and seeing bodies dumped overboard before the crews abandoned them when the Thais started cracking down on the smugglers. The International Organization for Migration has estimated that 10 to 15% of the world's migrants, or between 23 and 35 million people, are undocumented. Even if they reach their destinations, the undocumented remain vulnerable. People who falsify documents, overstay visas, or work in an underground economy often fear deportation if they go to police or others for help. And sovereign nations, of course, are not obligated to or capable of opening their borders to everyone seeking a better life. But migrants need to be carefully screened and protected if being sent home would put them at risk. So, what is our country doing about this global problem? The United States leads in contributing to humanitarian operations around the world. We do this chiefly by working with the top United Nations and other international organizations in this field. My bureau at the State Department funds the UN Refugee Agency, UNHCR, the International Committee of the Red Cross, the International Organization for Migration, and others. The U.S. Agency for International Development funds the World Food Program, and some of the other top UN agencies like UNICEF and non-governmental organizations and charities that work in this field. These operations deliver essential life-saving assistance: food, shelter, medical care, clean water, and sanitation. They protect the rights of the displaced, care for survivors of sexual violence, reunify families, educate children and youth, and help people gain the skills they need to be self-sufficient. We can do this year after year because of steadfast support from Congress. Even in an era when bipartisanship often seems dead, lawmakers continue to come together to generously fund humanitarian efforts. Lawmakers have also supported our refugee resettlement program, which identifies some of the world's most vulnerable refugees, brings them here, and offers them a fresh start. The United States resettles more refugees than all other countries combined. Now, I said this the other day in Seattle, and the NPR interviewer instantly said, "What are you talking about? You don't come close to what is happening in Germany." Well, in Germany, those are people walking into the country who are asylum seekers. I'm talking about UNHCR's program that actively reviews applications from people in the field, and then we choose to invite them to come to the United States. Most refugees get jobs, enroll their children in school, pay taxes, revitalize communities, and after 5 years may choose to take the test to become naturalized American citizens. They contribute immeasurably to the life of our nation. As you may have heard, next year we will accept at least 10,000 refugees from Syria. Some critics say that number is too low. Others oppose admitting Syrians, arguing that terrorists may seek to enter the United States as refugees. And in the last couple of weeks, we have members of Congress introducing legislation to stop Syrians from coming. I don't know if it'll pass. I think they're just trying to satisfy letters coming into them from a vocal minority. But there is a split among those who want us to bring many, many more refugees and those who are very concerned that we will somehow use this program. This program will be used by terrorists to enter the country. So we are taking every possible precaution to make sure that doesn't happen. Specially trained Department of Homeland Security officials screen applicants, conducting extensive security checks and lengthy in-person interviews. This process is deliberately thorough and careful, and we are working to speed it up. But the days of airlifting hundreds of refugees and bringing them to Guam or to Fort Dix, New Jersey, ended on September 11th, 2001. We are, however, determined to do more to help the world's refugees. This is why Secretary Kerry announced that the United States would increase the number we will resettle here annually from 70,000 the ceiling for the past 3 years to 85,000 this year and 100,000 in fiscal year 2017. So that will grow by 50% over the 2 years. U.S. humanitarian aid and diplomacy are, I believe, vital. In crisis after crisis, we have been able to spearhead the international response and use our influence to help keep borders open and aid flowing. And this has saved millions of lives. I'm convinced of it. But today's aid groups are stretched thin. The World Food Program was forced to cut food rations to Syrian refugees in the Middle East. They've subsequently gotten some more money, but that may have been one of the triggers of the flow of refugees to Europe, was that the refugees living around Syria saw that their aid was going down. In fact, all of the UN humanitarian organizations are grappling with severely insufficient funds to address a long list of crises. The United Nations is seeking $19.5 billion for humanitarian assistance for this calendar year, 2015, and it's received less than half of what it was looking for, even though we're now in November, so most of the fiscal year is over. How can we close this yawning gap and meet such vast needs? Private giving could help. In just 1 week after the photo of Aylan Kurdi, the drowned Syrian toddler, hit social media, donations for the U.S. Fund for UNICEF jumped more than 600%. The charity Save the Children raised 4 times more in that week than it had over the previous 8 months. This is a big change from previous patterns of giving, and the question for me is whether this level of engagement will last. In general, even people who give generously for disaster relief tend to shy away from man-made crises. Private donors may be reticent because man-made crises can be messy and complex. Image after image of bombings, barbed wire, and misery can be overwhelming, even numbing. But 7 million children have been affected by Syria's crisis. Millions have suddenly found themselves impoverished. Families have married off young daughters and sent sons out to work because they would otherwise go hungry or have no money for rent. Children have not been able to go to school, and many have been traumatized. A whole generation urgently needs help and care. And this is why my colleagues and I support the No Lost Generation campaign launched by UN agencies and non-governmental organizations. To cope with the magnitude of these crises, we also need more nations to contribute what they can. Countries already shouldering enormous responsibilities need help. Because of Syria's war, Germany now leads the world in taking in asylum seekers or refugees who travel on their own to a new country and then petition to stay. According to UNHCR, Turkey now hosts more refugees than any other nation, and Lebanon has absorbed so many Syrians that every 5th person living there is now a refugee. But other nations, too, are coping with large influxes of people in need. Uganda accepts refugees from the Democratic Republic of Congo, South Sudan, Somalia, and Burundi, and allows them to work and farm to support themselves. Ethiopia hosts refugees from Eritrea in the north, Sudan and South Sudan in the west, and Somalia in the south. 2 years ago, I traveled to Burkina Faso and was amazed because the Burkinabe had not only opened their border to refugees from Mali, they had let them bring their cattle and other animals and shared their pasture lands so that these pastoral people could support their families. And as I've said to others, there's a first time for everything, and this was my first time meeting refugee animals. The same handful of nations that always provides financial backing for aid operations is doing it now. In addition to the United States, these traditional donors include Western European governments, Canada, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and more recently, Korea. At critical junctures in the past few years, the Saudis, Kuwaitis, and Emiratis have given hundreds of millions of dollars to help cope with the emergencies in Syria, Iraq, and Yemen. But donations from the Gulf countries have not always flowed through UN agencies and tend to come as one-off, unique contributions. I would like to see these countries become regular annual donors and contribute through the top-notch aid agencies. This can ensure funding is not wasted and is well allocated and coordinated. We also would like to see some of the world's other economically and politically powerful nations, like Russia, India, and China, more engaged on humanitarian issues. In addition to rallying more donors, we are adapting to changing needs and looking to make humanitarian aid more efficient. The majority of refugees today actually don't live in camps. They live in cities and towns. Instead of handouts, they may need to be handed an ATM card, or better yet, a work permit. Instead of a one-size-fits-all approach, vulnerable groups such as women and children, the elderly and the disabled, need aid tailored for them. Relief and development experts need to collaborate to help countries like Lebanon and Jordan, Chad and Niger, that have taken in huge numbers of refugees despite their fragile economies. Development agencies should build more classrooms, hospital wards, and water systems so that societies hosting refugees do not suffer for having done the right thing. The World Humanitarian Summit that UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon has scheduled for spring 2016 offers an opportunity to call attention to what does and doesn't work in humanitarian response and recruit more governments and organizations to invest in best practices. We can help governments respond humanely when migrants and refugees arrive at their borders. This is a big issue right now in Southern Europe. We can crack down on human smuggling and explore legal alternatives to dangerous, irregular migration. Legal migration can fill gaps in the labor pool and provide a financial lifeline to families and communities back home. Finally, and most importantly, we must stay vigilant and engaged and take whatever action we can to stop ethnic, religious, and political rivalries from exploding into violence. We must do what we can to prevent life from being so bleak that risking death seems preferable. The point is that whatever we do, however incremental, it matters. Whether they are visible under the glare of TV cameras arriving in Europe or in more remote corners of the earth, each person fleeing has a story. Often these are stories of incredible determination to survive, to protect their families, and to make something of their lives. They seek safety, but also seek the dignity that all people deserve. Despite borders and barriers, despite our different circumstances, our fates are linked, and their fight should not only be theirs, but our own. Thank you very much.
Microphones, so if you have questions, hey Jackie, use your broadcast voice.
Okay. Thanks. I'm Jackie Miller, World Affairs Council of Seattle. Thank you, Secretary Richard, for talking to us at a sold-out event Monday night and then being with us tonight. There are a lot of actors in this mess. There are the UN agencies, UNHCR, the World Peace Program. You've got PRM. Thank you. You've got PRM and other U.S. agencies. You've got, colleagues in other states with a similar mandate. And then you've got the NGOs like Save the Children, like the IRC. So there are a lot of, this is a crowded space, but it needs to be more crowded because the need is very great. How do all of these actors coordinate to ensure as best they can that the aid is getting where it needs to go and how that aid is prioritized?
The coordination is done usually in the field, and it's done in a way that surprises people who are used to more top-down hierarchical organizations. I like to say instead of a blanket, it's more like a patchwork quilt, because organizations show up, they assess what's needed, and then they try to fill a niche where they can lend expertise to something that's needed. So what you see is that the well-regarded organizations are very professional about this. They hire people with experience. They have people who live up to standards and have the requisite training. and know how it should work and work together. And the coordination part is really the responsibility of the UN's Emergency Response Coordinator, or Undersecretary General Stephen O'Brien, and his staff. And it has evolved this way over time. It's not a perfect system. It works amazingly well given how fragmented and somewhat ad hoc it is in putting it together. What you see is that there are organizations that choose to work somewhat independently of this entire spectrum of organizations, and notable among those would be Doctors Without Borders, MSF, and also the International Committee of the Red Cross tends to take a very independent stance. Even though we fund them, they choose not to advertise that in many of the conflict zones in which they work, because sometimes they're right in the heart of the most dangerous places. But a lot of the other organizations, MSF won't take money from the US government. A lot of the other organizations that you've heard of are partners of ours. They get funded by my office or by USAID's Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance. Save the Children, Catholic Relief Services, Mercy Corps, International Medical Corps, International Rescue Committee, where I used to work, and others like that that have very good reputations, have been around for a while, and hire top-notch folks. So the people who are most, I find that sometimes the people who are most thrown by this patchwork approach are people from militaries, because they just have a very different way of doing things. And so there's a lot of work to be done, I find, that has been done in educating back and forth. One helpful thing from a few years ago was a set of guidelines that were produced by Interaction, the coalition of relief and development NGOs, and some of the personnel in the Joint Chiefs office, to say, look, if you're military, you wear a uniform. If you're an NGO person, don't you dare put on a camouflage shirt. If you're military, you have a gun, but you observe the laws of war. If you're an NGO person, you should not be riding around in vehicles with guns. And that type of understanding is very well understood by these organizations I mentioned that are among the best. But sometimes there's a lot of people who, in a complex situation, will rush in to help and can actually do some damage. What do I mean by that? People who don't know the practices can be, for example, bringing in things that take up space on airplanes and on airport runways, and they don't have a handoff to give the equipment or donations to someone else. So that's a step backwards. So we really prize having organizations that are voluntary, are independently run, but live up to sort of a common set of practices and standards. They're called the SPEAR standards, and good humanitarian practices.
Okay. You mentioned the figure of $29.5 billion being requested. What does that money actually get spent on, and how does it get decided where it goes?
I mentioned which part?
I think you said the UN was requesting something like 19.5 billion.
Yeah, for all of the crises. I can't quite find you. Can you raise your hand? Oh. How'd you throw your voice back there? $19.5 billion and climbing. And so the U.S., we get sent appeals from the top UN agencies where they put together their requests for funds. And when we detect that there are missing pieces to that, we'll put out a grant proposal or request proposals for grants. So part of this will be through contributions, which is essentially giving a check over to UN agencies. And part of it, though, is NGOs competing against each other, proposing what they will do and being funded. So the tricky things with this is I think that we have to do more than hand them a check, and we do. In the case of my bureau, we have a relationship with those organizations, so we have an active conversation back and forth. We also try as the U.S. government not to earmark too heavily and steer money to one type of program or another, in part because we think we want to make sure that there's a good coverage of what's needed to be done in the field, although other countries will say, well, we'll fund education or we'll fund clinics, and we want a banner up there that says, we funded this. And then, the NGOs can generally be more nimble. Sometimes they can be innovative. They can be sometimes in places that are more dangerous early. They can shift policies quicker. The UN can bring people who have worked for years, and they can bring people with clout, and they can bring numbers with them. So these tend to be complementary responses. What we don't do is we don't hire lots of aid workers and parachute them into places. We're funding another organization to do the work. And when we talk about humanitarians, they try to be neutral and impartial and give aid to whoever's in need, if they're an innocent civilian, on any side of the battle lines. The U.S. government is not impartial. We have a foreign policy. We have countries and allies and groups that we support and others that we oppose or tolerate. And but the humanitarians that we fund are not doing it to support U.S. policy. They're doing it to save people's lives. And yet that indirectly then does support our national interest because it tries to stabilize situations, rescue people, and give them another chance for another day.
Rich Lauf, Greater Cincinnati World Affairs Council. My question is, where is the balance between the current flows of refugees and the absorptive capacities of the countries? I mean, if you look, even Germany, Eastern Europe is having political reaction. Your comment about Lebanon, now 20% refugees, which I've heard before. Jordan, in a probably similar situation. When do you start running at the limit of what a country can absorb, and where do you see the biggest problems in that regard?
Well, that's what these countries that encircle Syria would like the Europeans to notice is how many more, 4 million are living in their neighborhood, even as hundreds of thousands walk to Europe. So we very much support responsibility sharing, and would like to see the Europeans succeed in their proposals to have more countries involved in hosting refugees. For Jordan and Lebanon specifically, we support more development assistance going into these countries. We have a very strong program for Jordan already, but the sense is that it's not good enough to just continue the way we had been. We have to do more, and we have to do more that is visible to the societies who are hosting these refugees, so they don't feel that they should resent the refugees, that when the schools go to double shifts, so that Syrian children can go in the afternoon, we want the citizens of those countries to say, well, at least they're building new schools, and my kid's still getting a good education, and not feel that their kid's education is being somehow undermined by having done the right thing and taking in Syrians. Lebanon is the country that most of my colleagues who work on the Middle East are concerned about in terms of the destabilizing impact of having so many refugees, because it's just not it's a fragile country in terms of its economy and its political situation, its society. And that's the one that I think my colleagues lose the most sleep over. Each of these countries has its strengths and its sort of treasures and marvels, the way Syria used to. Now, of course, Syria's been completely devastated. And in talking about development, the real big development project will be reconstructing Syria. when the day finally comes, that peace returns there.
This may be a bit of a follow-up to the last question, but I empathize with this topic because my parents were refugees. But are you aware of
Where did they come from?
Eritrea, and they immigrated to Italy?
Yeah.
Are you aware of any kind of incentive to encourage EU member states to provide asylum, either than Germany and Italy kind of being the bigger nations allowing so many of at least East African refugees into their countries?
Yeah, I first met Eritrean refugees coming across the border into camps in Ethiopia, and I was shocked by their demographic profile. There were so many young people. Normally you see families come across a border. This was youth, and some, really young teenagers walking by themselves across a dangerous area to get to Ethiopia. And my concern for them was they needed places to play, they needed school, they needed people to keep an eye on them. And they weren't really interested in that because they had the number of an uncle in Norway in their pocket, and they were just going to keep walking. And this was one of the most shocking situations I've seen. I've seen some pretty hairy situations in the last few years. And a large number of Eritreans are on those boats that go from Libya to Italy. And I believe that under this new sharing arrangement, some of the first refugees flown from Italy to Sweden were Eritreans. But what we're not seeing is a really serious, big agreement to do that within the European countries. There is an understanding in Europe, the way there is in the US, with children coming up from Central America, that the real solutions lie in doing more in the countries of origin. So in the case of Eritrea, it would mean a different government or a different governmental practice to draft children or young people into the military and not let them out for years and years and years. In the sense of Central America, we have to do something about the criminal gangs that are terrorizing families in El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. And that's partly why, the U.S. Agency for National Development, State Department's Latin America office has to do more there. So I see these similarities. And I know that the Europeans are trying to do more in the countries of origin, and now it's also West Africa. The routes going to Libya come from across the continent and also north from West Africa. But the problem also is that the money just doesn't stretch far enough to do all this development work that needs to be done, but also then deal with the conflicts, this long list of conflicts. What I would love to see is that long list that I read out to you shortened. Because then we could do, I think, really focus in on some of the toughest ones.
Is this on? It is. Hi. So I'm wondering if we could move down the flow chart, if you will, to when people, for whatever reason, come here. There's a vast number, as you said, of refugees flowing now. Eventually more and more will come to the United States. One way that I've been thinking about this is how do we duplicate the, let's call it, relative success of bringing something like 1 million Vietnamese, Laotians, Cambodians, et cetera, into the U.S. and integrating very well into U.S. society and leading U.S. society. How would that look here, say, 10, 20 years down the road?
Yeah. So there's 60 million displaced people, 19 million refugees. UNHCR is responsible for 14, 15 million of them. And about 1 million are designated as could benefit the most from resettlement. And then last year, 100,000 were resettled, with the U.S. taking 70,000. So when you work down the numbers, it's a very small fraction of the world's refugees will get resettled. This is one reason why our programs overseas are so important, to help the majority of the refugees. But we really believe in my office that this resettlement program is part of an American tradition, and that we are a country where many of us are descended from immigrants and refugees, and that, in fact, these programs not only rescue lives, but strengthen our country. So I'm under a lot of pressure right now to take the process we use, which involves a couple of international organizations and 3 U.S. government agencies and lots of private nonprofits across the U.S., and speed it up. Bring more, but also move them faster. Because on average, it takes 18 to 24 months between getting the referral from the UN Refugee Agency that a family might benefit from resettlement to actually getting them here to the airport and having them met by one of the 9 national networks that work with us. 6 are faith-based, 3 are non-sectarian, that help the refugees get a apartment and get the kids enrolled in school and get everybody get a social security number and try to help the able-bodied adults get a job, and if someone has medical needs, get those tended to, enroll in any kind of benefits program for which they qualify. So I think the part about absorption into the U.S. is actually, we could do a lot more than we currently do. I think the security screening part and the UNHCR's own resources to refer refugees to us will need to be beefed up quite a bit. We have to invest more in that and in the Department of Homeland Security if we're going to bring larger numbers. One tricky thing about DHS's budget is the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Service that interviews the refugees overseas. Any growth there is paid for by fees collected from people who use their services. So we're talking about people applying for green cards or to bring families to the U.S. So that's putting more and more of a burden sort of on some of the people least able to pay for that. But there seems to be a lot of people right now who are saying that in light of what's happening in Europe, in light of what's happening in the Middle East and around the world, we should be bringing far more people.
Let's thank the Assistant Secretary. She was an exchange student in Austria not too long ago. She's going to Vienna tonight, as I mentioned, to assist the Secretary in peace negotiations on Syria. So it was a real treat to have you here today with us, Assistant Secretary Richard. Thank you very much for your dedication to this incredibly important issue. We're going to commence with the dinner portion of the program and enjoy the conversation.